Some stories don't begin with a body. They begin with a silence so deep you can feel the state pressing its thumb over an entire landscape. In southern Thailand, people accused of communist ties were taken, erased, and in some accounts burned in oil drums. And even now, decades later, the dead are still fighting to be counted, while the living are still carrying what the country never fully answered. This episode contains discussion of state violence, torture, disappearance, and mass killing. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from historical reporting, academic research, memorial material, and survivor and family remembrance. Where the record is disputed, incomplete, or preserved more through memory than through official accountability. I'll say so plainly, and I won't fill in the gaps. Later, there will be a clearly labeled outside the record section, kept separate from the verified timeline and not presented as fact. Listener discretion is advised. Before anyone was burned, they were first renamed. That's how a story like this begins. Not with fire, not with a drum. It begins when a government teaches itself to stop seeing people as neighbors and start seeing them as threats, categories, shadows on a map. In Thailand's long Cold War, especially as the communist insurgency deepened, the state's fear of subversion hardened into a security logic that reached far beyond armed fighters and into civilian life. The province sat inside that pressure. In the early 1970s, places like Lamsin were treated as red strongholds, areas where anti-communist policy was not just discussed from a podium, but imposed on the ground by security forces working under the Communist Suppression Operations Command and related state units. Once a place is marked that way, everybody inside it starts living under the same cloud. The guilty, the innocent, the politically active, the quiet, the people who believe something, the people who believe nothing at all. Soon, the word communist stopped being a precise accusation and became a loose category wide enough to swallow civilians. In the record, those later targeted in Phatthalung were often described as people accused of communist activity or of helping, sheltering, or sympathizing with communists. That is a very different thing from proving that someone was an armed insurgent. It creates a wide and dangerous zone where suspicion can do the work of evidence and rumor can do the work of law. So the world these people were living in was already bending before the worst of it came. The state was not entering daily life as some distant abstraction. It was arriving through surveillance, interrogation, detention, and the ordinary terror of being named. A villager did not need to be a revolutionary to be pulled into that machinery. In the record, civilians are central to the story, not incidental to it. This was not simply a battlefield story. It was a story about what happens when civilian space gets treated like enemy territory. If you listen closely, the human part is already there before the killing method ever enters the frame. You can feel it in the later memory work around the case, where descendants and local communities do not talk about abstractions first. They talk about relatives, about people taken, about absence settling into a household and never really leaving. Recent reporting on the memorial landscape there treats the killings not as a sealed chapter in a textbook, but as something still carried in family memory, still close enough to touch. The memory never really went quiet. Recent public posts continue to announce remembrance events for the Red Drum killings, and recent cultural reporting shows community built a memorial space still functioning as a place where the dead are named and the silence around them is challenged. That doesn't give us every fact we want. It doesn't resolve the gaps, but it tells us something important before we go any further. The people at the center of this story were never fully lost to the people who loved them. Once accusation became enough, the machinery got simple in the ugliest possible way. People were arrested, or just taken, in broad sweeps across the province and brought into detention camps for interrogation. Some came back out, others didn't. And that split right there is what makes this section feel so cold. The line between release and death could rest on rumor, convenience, local suspicion, or the needs of a state that had already decided fear was more useful than proof. The survivors and later researchers describe a process that was not chaotic so much as methodical. Men suspected of communist ties, or of helping, feeding, sheltering, or sympathizing with the wrong people were questioned under violence. Haberkorn's work says some detainees were tortured and then killed. Thai historical and memorial reporting goes further in its descriptions of the beatings, saying suspects were struck until unconscious before being moved toward the drums. The exact sequence varies from source to source, but the center of it does not. Detention, torture, selection, death. And then the method that gave the killings their name comes into focus. The victims were put into empty 200-liter oil drums, doused with fuel, and burned. Accounts differ on the exact mechanics, but not on the center of it. Detainees were tortured and executed by burning in drums. That disagreement in detail matters, but not in the way deniers like to use it. It does not weaken the case. It tells you what these killings were designed to do. They were built to erase evidence, destroy the body, and leave families with smoke, rumor, and terror instead of something they could carry to court. One reason the record stays fractured is because the method itself was a weapon against memory. Burn the person, burn the proof, and then let time do the rest. There is one detail that keeps surviving anyway, and it stays with you. In Haberkorn's account, and in later Thai feature, reporting grounded in local memory, truck or GMC engines were revved, while the killings happened to cover the screams coming from the camp. Even there, the state could not fully hide what it was doing. The people who lived nearby remembered both sounds together, the engines and the human voices underneath them. That's the kind of detail that survives because it does not read like propaganda. It reads like something a person never forgets after hearing it once. The numbers don't resolve cleanly either. Student investigators in 1975 interviewed 809 villagers who said family members had been killed, but they were able to verify only about 200 deaths directly. From there, they estimated the real toll was much higher, possibly in the thousands. State officials and official inquiries pushed those numbers sharply downward, at times minimizing the dead to a few dozen. That gap is not a side issue. It tells you what the next struggle became. First, people were killed. Then even their number became a battlefield. Then the silence broke. In February 1975, student activists exposed what had happened in Phatthalung, bringing into public view a series of killings that had taken place roughly 2.5 years earlier. This story does not move from crime to courtroom. It moves from terror to exposure, and then into the long, ugly space where a country knows enough to be shaken, but still does not do enough to call it justice. So when you ask about court proceedings, about convictions, about verdicts, the answer is brutal in its simplicity. There was never a real ending of that kind. Even after the fall of military rule in the wake of the October 1973 uprising, the killings were never seriously investigated, and no perpetrator was punished. No meaningful legal reckoning came that matched the scale of what had been done. And that absence changed the burden of memory. When the state refuses to hold itself to account, the dead do not disappear. They get carried somewhere else. into families, into villages, into oral memory, into the kinds of stories people tell carefully, because for a long time telling them at all could cost you something. Later, scholarship and local memory work made clear that the Red Drum killings survived not because the state preserved the truth, but because ordinary people did. You can feel that in the memorial life around the killings now. In Lamsin, the historical memorial site was created by the community in 1995 at or near the former camp area, and commemorations continue there year after year. Recent Thai reporting and public event posts show remembrance ceremonies still being organized in 2024 and 2025, which tells you this is not dead history sitting quietly in an archive. It is still being tended, still being named, still being brought back into daylight on purpose. Beyond the verified record, another set of questions remained. This next part is built from survivor memory, local talk, later historical argument, and the questions that stay alive when a state never fully opens its files. Even the strongest scholars on this case say the record is still full of gaps, inaccessible documents, conflicting counts, and obscured chains of responsibility. One of the strongest readings people carry forward is that this was never only about removing suspected communists. It was also about teaching a lesson, not just to armed insurgents, but to farmers, families, teachers, neighbors, and anyone else watching. The killing was the message. That reading is not just rumor. It is echoed in scholarship that describes the violence as both instrumental and exemplary, and in local memory that treats the cruelty itself as something meant to terrify the wider population into obedience. Then there's the darker village-level suspicion, the one that usually shows up whenever the state builds its target lists in secret. Who got named and why? Local reporting and later historical analysis suggest that some of the names came through informants, some through state lists, and sometimes the identifying information was barely more than a surname, a given name, or a nickname. That is where the long shadow of personal betrayal enters the story. Not as a proven master key, but as a possibility people have never stopped talking about. That some of the dead may have been swept in because somebody pointed, somebody guessed, somebody settled something old, or somebody in uniform simply decided a partial match was close enough. Another lasting suspicion is that the lower official count functioned less as clarity than as containment. In the public afterlife of this case, many came to believe the smaller number served to shrink the moral blast radius, to make the killings easier to deny, easier to move past. There is also a wider theory about time. Some historians argue that what people now call the Red Drum killings may actually be the best-known section of a broader run of CSOC or ISOC atrocities that stretched earlier and longer than the cleanest official version suggests. One declassified US diplomatic cable discussed alleged atrocities in roughly 1969 to 1971, and later analysis uses that to argue that the killings remembered under the Red Drum name may belong to a larger series of counterinsurgency murders, rather than one neatly bounded episode. That does not give us perfect certainty, but it does help explain why the dates, counts, and methods never fit together as cleanly as people want them to. And when people ask, quietly or angrily, who really sat high enough in the chain to own this, one later historical analysis points toward General Sant Chitpatima, then the 5th Military Circle Commander and the CSOC Regional Commander in the Mid-South, as the man in charge of the operations sphere. That is not a conviction. It is not a verdict. It is a later reconstruction from declassified material and earlier literature. But it matters because it pushes the story away from the comforting fantasy of a few nameless monsters running wild and back towards something colder. Command, structure, permission. There's one more layer people return to, especially historians reading this against the larger Cold War map. Some argue that even if outside powers did not know every detail in real time, the broader alliance structure made real pressure unlikely anyway. Zippel's reading of declassified documents suggests US officials prioritized the Thai military relationship and anti-communist goals over confronting abuses in Phatthalung. So in that reading, the silence around the killings was not only Thai. It sat inside a bigger geopolitical silence, one where dead villagers in the south were simply not important enough to interrupt strategy. Maybe that is why the memory around this case still feels unsettled. Too many versions of the story were forced to live side by side. The official count and the local count, the state explanation and the family explanation, the security story and the human story. Even recent memorial writing and local remembrance still frame the Red Drum killings as a wound suspended between the state, the communist struggle, and ordinary villagers caught in between. That tension is still there. You can feel it in the way descendants speak, in the way memorial spaces stand, and in the way the dead still seem to be waiting not only to be remembered, but to be answered. What stays with me here is not the machinery of it, not the slogans, not the language that was used to make ordinary people easier to destroy. What stays is the human cost of being marked, taken, and then pushed so far outside the protection of the law that even the counting of the dead became uncertain. Some of the people in this story were never given a fair accusation, never given a real defense, never given the dignity of a system willing to answer honestly for what was done to them. If this story meant something to you, follow the show wherever you listen, and pass this episode to someone who cares about the histories that power tried to bury. Quiet stories like this don't survive by accident. They survive because people keep making room for them. Sources for this episode include historical and academic work by Tyrell Habercorn and Matthew Zippel, Thai historical material from the King Prajathipok's Institute database, recent feature reporting and remembrance coverage from the Momentum, and public memorial and commemoration material tied to the Red Drum killings in the South. Until next time, remember them as people before anything else. Their names deserve better than what history gave them, where the land remembers what others try to forget.